Evening, folks. Thank you for joining us for our very first webinar. We'll be kicking off at 6:30 on the dot, just letting a few more join us in time. But really pleased you could join us this evening. We've got quite a lot of things to get through, but we'll pack it into an hour. And if you've got any questions or anything, then please drop them in the chat box. I'll just put a reminder for that in there. But yeah, we'll start at 6:30 in a minute or two. Okay, we've got a few more joining us. As I say, we'll just start in a minute at 6:30 as promised. Don't like to keep people waiting around, but we're all poised and ready to go. I think, aren't we, Katie?
We are, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, ready to rumble.
Primed and ready to go. There we are. Excellent. But yeah, hoping you can hear us all right. Any problems with sound quality or anything, then do just drop us a note in the chat window. But we will make a start imminently. Right, folks, it's 6:30, and I think we'll make a start. Thank you so much for joining us for this, our very first landlord webinar. We've run seminars before here in Witney, but we know not all of our landlords are local, and so we wanted to bring you a digital update, but also one that was bang up to date with the legislation that has changed recently, and of course the topic of the moment, which is the Renters Reform Bill and all that's going on with that. Very timely, as we're in the party conference season at the moment, but I'm delighted that I'm joined this evening. Sorry, I'm Brendan from Parkers, and I'm joined by Joy, the branch manager of Parkers Witney, and Katie, who's our senior property manager here in Witney. And collectively, you know, many years experience of managing properties here in Oxfordshire. And so we wanted to share with you some of the key bits and pieces that are going to be affecting our industry and our sector in the near future. Just one point of note, if you do have any questions, we'll absolutely pick those up at the end. So please pop those in the chat box on the corner of your screen, and then we'll go through those at the end and answer any questions that you have, rather than intersperse the presentation with those. But as I say, we're aiming to be no more than an hour, so that you can get off to watch Bake Off and all those other important things in life. Without further ado, this is what we'll be covering. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an estate and letting agent. And by the way, all three of us are qualified with the Property Mark lettings qualification. Some of what we're talking about is already in law. Some of it has been proposed. Some of it we are working on our best understanding of what is likely to be coming, and we're reading between the lines and looking about what has changed most recently in the past and how that can be applied looking forwards. But we'll try and be clear when we know what we're talking about, when we think we know what we're talking about, and when we're having a best guess, because it's still yet to be finalised. But as I say, this is the biggest change, the Renters Reform Bill, since the Landlord Housing Act 1988. So, substantial change going on. But thankfully, Parkers have a seat at the Lettings Industry Council, who are advising the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And so we do get some early insights into what they're thinking and how changes might be rolled out. So that's really important. But as I say, this is not all carved in stone. We'll be trying to be clear about those things which are, and those things which we are just having a best guess at as things change.
So first up is the legislation update. So at the beginning of the month, there was a new how to rent guide issued. Now this is issued by the government, and it is a vital piece of paperwork that we give tenants. It is part of the prescribed information, and if it isn't given to the tenant in the correct way and in the correct time, then it can have a detrimental effect to your tenancy and gaining possession of the tenancy at the end when you issue a Section 21. Joy will cover off a bit in further detail about Section 21, but the How to Rent Guide came out at the beginning of the month, and you must ensure that all your tenants moving forward and any tenants you've issued Section 21s on recently have that up-to-date guide, and it must be the physical guide, not a link to it. So a PDF attached, not the link to the government website version. The next legislation is the EPCs. So this was due to come in 2026 and then 2028. It has been postponed. Our message at the moment is to carry on with any works that you need. If you have a property that's D or E and it does need some vital works to get back up to C, bear in mind the cost of living, the cost of materials and labour is increasing day by day. So do get those works done, use this time wisely, get your contractors' prices locked in, get that done so that as soon as it comes into force, you're all ready to go. There will be exemptions to that, listed buildings, properties that need substantial money put into them to get up to the level required, but we will keep you up to date as and when we know this information.
So we understand now that the Renters Reform Bill, as I said already, is the biggest legislative change that we've been facing since the late 80s, and that this will be of concern to our landlords. But our key message is this: a well-managed property that is in good order, really fundamentally, there isn't a huge amount of change. Now, there's some details in the technical bit, but the key message is don't panic. And the reason we say that is rental properties, particularly here in West Oxfordshire, are achieving the best rents they've ever done. And that means the yields are the highest we've ever seen. Demand is rising, stock levels are shrinking, and that is going to support the sort of rents that we're seeing at the moment. And Katie's going to cover a bit more of that later on. But now is not the time to sell when demand is so high. But interestingly, one of the things that is really key that was hidden away within the first draft of the Renters Reform Bill is poaching of enforcement officers. And what I mean by that is, we all know that in West Oxfordshire there isn't a huge amount of enforcement at the moment, and some people perhaps chance their arm a bit. Other parts of the country are very different. For example, Coventry, they're very hot on enforcement. When this comes in as tabled, those enforcement officers in Coventry will be able to enforce in West Oxfordshire. And much of this they'll be able to enforce without actually having to leave their desks, because the information will be online. And most of the offences within this are civil offences for which the fine is up to £30,000. And so you can imagine there's a huge incentive there for those local authorities that have good enforcement agencies or have the capacity to deal with this to earn some serious money. And so, I think it's fair to say that the enforcement of this will be much hotter than it has been with other things in the past. Equally, if you already use an agent or you're thinking about using an agent, then they need to be all over this. They need to understand the implications of this and be able to communicate that to their clients. And so if you've got an agent or you're speaking to agents, ask them about this, because they don't understand it, then they might not be the right agent for you. There's an awful lot going on here. Give people a test, try them out at this stage. But as I say, most things will see fines of up to £30,000. Now, here's a sort of summary, top level, of what is currently within the Rent Reform Bill. Obviously, the big ticket items are what the press have picked up on, the abolition of Section 21 notices, so-called no-fault evictions, creating assured or open-ended tenancies. There are a load of new grounds for possession, and I'll be coming back to that later on. And the fact that rents can only be charged monthly or every 28 days, which Katie is going to cover in more detail. Although we're already getting wind, there might be some amendments to that part. And also some rent increase control. Now, I'm worded that very carefully. They're not talking about rent caps, but the mechanism by which you can increase rents will be different from that which it is today, and that will control the way in which they are or they go about. Other stuff that's in there, pets, we'll cover that in some detail, because I know there's some concern over landlords being potentially forced to accept pets. written terms for all tenancies, and I'll come back to that as well. The way that tenants give notice is going to change. And as I mentioned already, virtually everything within this will be covered by civil penalties, and virtually everything will see fines of up to £30,000. Redress schemes in the property portal, Joy's going to cover in a lot more detail later. And I've already mentioned about enforcement authorities and the fact they will be looking to seek opportunities, not necessarily on their doorstep. But also, interestingly, what was missing from the bill are things that we have heard about in the past. For example, the short let portal, that's been parked, and that'll be part of the levelling up bill. The decent home standards and bans on no children or no DSS aren't currently within the Renters Reform Bill. Now, they might come as a later amendment, or they might come as a separate piece of legislation or added to a different piece of legislation. But at the moment, those are not included within the Renters Reform Bill.
So rents, as Brendan touched on, there is going to be a change in rents. Rents will only be able to be charged to tenants in a monthly or a 28-day period. Now, most of your tenancy agreements do that anyway. The biggest impact it will have will be on the council housing and the universal credit system as well. There will be a bit of a change to any tenants coming from abroad. So when tenants come from abroad at the moment, we would ask them to pay 12 months rent in advance because of referencing issues. Now, we believe it to be that we'll still be able to do that, but the rent will only be charged monthly. So it's all in the way that you write your tenancy agreement, which again is why you need to make sure you've got a really good qualified agent behind you who's writing the best possible tenancy agreement. So how will you be able to increase your rent? So previously you are able to at the moment and carry on doing rent review clauses within your tenancy. That will then stop, and you will need to issue section 13s. So they are a legal notice where you issue to the tenant 2 months notice of increasing the rent. You can do this every year, so every 12 months you issue that notice. Now, if the tenant feels that the rent you've increased to is above market value rent, they will have the right to go to the first tier property tribunal service. Now, at the moment, if a tenant does that currently as we are today, there is a 6-month wait. Obviously, with this change, there's going to be a higher demand for this service, and we're anticipating that that time will lengthen. During that time, you are not able to demand your increased rent, So you will only be able to demand the current rent. So you could have a 6-month delay on your increased rent coming in, and it is not also a given thing that you will be issued that rent backwards. So you may lose that. So when you're looking at the rents, it's really important that you don't go above market value rent and you are being truly fair. So that brings me on to your tenancy agreements. You've got 2 types of periodic tenancies. You've got the contractual periodic tenancy and the statutory periodic tenancy. So in our tenancy agreements, we ensure that you have a clause in there to move from a fixed term tenancy onto a contractual periodic tenancy. This means that if a tenant wishes to leave, they do in fact have to give 1 month's notice. Now, why is that important as a landlord? It means that your tenant gives you that at least 1 month's notice and you're not left with a vacant property. If that's not written into your tenancy, you can be left with a vacant property and therefore all of your associated costs. So council tax, water, gas, electric, and also importantly, no rent coming in. So what is our message here? It is to make sure that you fix your tenant into a fixed term tenancy. They will be one of the last tenancies to move on to the assured tenancy way of things. So get your tenant into a 12 or 18 month tenancy, reevaluate your market rent, make sure you are charging the correct rent that the market is demanding at the moment, and hopefully you'll be one of the last to move in. The rent review part is really important. So over the last 2 years, the market has moved on significantly. If you were coming to West Oxfordshire to rent a 2-bedroom home 2 years ago, you as a tenant would have been paying £800 to £900 a month. Today, you're paying between 11 and 1200, maybe even a little bit more. So it's really important that you get the money you're due for the rental and that you fix into a contract to 12 or 18 months. The other increase that we've seen is with our rent and legal protection. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. No one knows what's going to happen over the next few months going into winter, energy bills and everything that we saw last year and in previous years with COVID and people losing jobs. So a really good thing to have in place is rent and legal protection. It's a policy that we have in line with our referencing company. But if a tenant falls into arrears, this policy kicks in on day one of the arrears. So it pays the arrears and it also pays for the legal process. Once you've also got your tenant out, finally out of the property, and you've gone through that court process, it covers a period of time where you may need to do some works to the property. They may not have left it quite as you wanted. You need to do a big redeck and some new flooring. With this policy, you will still get rent for that period, which is really important for you to keep that money coming in, and then it can be re-rented out at the market rent. Now, if anything that we've covered in the last couple of slides, you're thinking, right, I need to talk to somebody about this. In a moment, a box will come up on the screen that you can click on for a free of charge 15-minute compliance check phone call with one of our team. If you click on that, it will take you directly to our diary. You can book in and then one of us will give you a call and we can run through it all with you.
Thanks, Katie. I'm going to cover off the big headline news, and I think it's a thing that the press have been banging on about since all the talk about this reform has taken place, and it's the end of no-fault evictions. Before I explain what that means on a practical level, I'll just cover off what we have at the moment. I think that will help explain what the changes are going to mean to landlords on the ground. Most tenancies that we have at the moment are assured short hold tenancies, and they're usually fixed terms for about 12 months time. At the end of that 12-month tenancy, the tenancy is either renewed for another 12 months or it goes periodic in the way that Katie has explained. For a landlord to get possession of the property at the end of that tenancy, they issue a Section 21 notice, and that gives the tenant 2 months notice that the landlord wants the property back. Now, that's all going to change, and this is the biggest single change in the private rented sector since the Housing Act of the late 1980s, and it has huge and far-reaching effects, because what we're going to have now is a single system of assured and periodic tenancies. So what does that mean? Well, it means that all tenancies, and I mean every tenancy, will start as a 2-month tenancy only. At the end of that 2-month period, it will come periodic. And the tenancy will only end if the tenant decides they want to give notice and leave, or if the landlord gains possession and has a valid reason to do so. And that's what we need to get our heads around going forward. The big press headline, no fault eviction. Well, why are they going on about that? What does that actually mean? And actually, it's not a huge difference to what we have at the moment. When we issue a Section 21 notice at the moment, we're still giving 2 months notice, but all we're doing is saying to the tenants, we need the property back. The big change is now the landlord needs to give a reason. Why do they want the property back? We're going to have a look at those reasons in a little bit more detail in a moment. So why are they doing all this in the first place? Why is the government changing what we think is a pretty good system already? We find Section 21s work well. They don't cost the landlords much. You can do it from home yourself. Go on, log on and do a Section 21 notice from the internet. And if you need to get possession, you can do that through the court, free of charge, more or less, just the basic costs for doing so. Now, why? And this is part of the bigger picture to improve the standards of rental housing and give tenants a bigger voice. They're trying to give tenants more security. They're going to try and make tenants feel like they've got more of a voice. It's also to try and give tenants a bit of flexibility. Now, lots of tenants, and we deal with quite a lot of tenants who maybe got divorced or they've got to move for jobs. If they're in a fixed term contract at the moment, they can't get out of that. And I think that what the government's trying to do is to give them more flexibility to be able to move on without the costs involved in all of that. The biggest reason, and I think this is part of the government's bigger picture of levelling up, is to give tenants a bit of a voice so that they're not trapped in properties that are poor quality housing. Lots of tenants are worried about speaking to their landlord to say, my boiler doesn't work, my house is cold, it's drafty, I need new flooring. What they're worried about is that tenants in periodic tenancies at the moment who have that will be given notice by their landlords and asked to leave. And that's what they're trying to sort out, to give tenants more voices and give landlords more accountability. So what's next with regard to Section 21s and getting possession of your properties? Well, the big message is don't panic. Really don't panic. Most tenants are happy. Most tenants are happy in their homes. They've made their homes. They want to be there for a long, long time. And if you do need to get possession, you can still do so. You'll just need to follow one of the basic grounds, which the government has outlined, to tell the tenant, I'm going to need the property back in a couple of months because of this. What we notice actually in our business here as agents is that we actually often get asked by tenants to actually serve them with notice. To get council housing, tenants have to be evicted, so to speak, and asked to get served Section 21s. So that's actually sort of counterproductive to what the government are trying to do. I think we need to watch this space because they need to get some further advice, and that's what we're doing as Parkers to provide them with this information. They need to find a balance between creating security and flexibility, but also making it work for landlords and for tenants.
Brilliant, thanks, Joy. So I'm going to be talking a bit more about possession now. And of course, one of the biggest concerns that we have as agents is, thankfully, very few cases at the moment do make it to court. But in the future, that is the only route that you're going to be able to obtain vacant possession. And so, bearing in mind the courts are already backed up, and at the moment, all that's being talked about are additional resources for the Ministry of Justice and not actually delivery of any additional resources for the courts. You know, that is only going to get worse. They're going to have this extra workload to cope with, and without streamlining the process or providing a fast track for housing issues, then it's only going to be clogged up further. And of course, if it's going to take longer and go through the courts, it's going to cost more money. And so ultimately, what that's going to mean is less sort of have a go yourself DIY type evictions. And certainly those companies at the moment that specialise in getting tenants out on behalf of landlords that you see on Channel 4 or whatever, you know, much of that will go as well, because actually it'll be the role of a solicitor to do this and not somebody effectively relying ultimately on a Section 21 notice to obtain vacant possession, which is what the majority of eviction specialists use at the moment. It's going to be more complex. It's going to involve the courts, and that is what's going to, you know, the route to vacant possession. And of course, we all know that if it's going to take longer to go through the courts, then those arrears are going to mount up. If they're not paying the rent now, and it takes 9 months to get to court, then those arrears are going to be larger and cost landlords more. So I think this is the crux of it from my perspective, is that what we really need is some sort of reform or additional resources for the Ministry of Justice so that actually the plans that have been outlined here can be delivered. And we'll be watching that very carefully. A quick mention as well about antisocial behaviour, because Rishi Sunak was talking earlier this year about antisocial behaviour and cracking down on that. One of the things that has made it into the first reading of the Renters Reform Bill is talking about being able to obtain vacant possession more easily through antisocial behaviour and eviction, pursuing that. And what's changed here is that at the moment, if you want to prove antisocial behaviour, then the person making that complaint, you know, has to stand up and point the finger at them and go to court and make a statement and all the rest of it. Actually, they're making that rather easier. And the crux of it now is, would this cause a nuisance to any reasonable person? And if the judge says the answer to that is yes, then they'll be able to grant vacant possession on the grounds of antisocial behaviour. And also, and it's the only ground that has changed to get shorter, that notice period would reduce from 28 days to 14 days. So, you know, if there is antisocial behaviour in the property and somebody's playing rock music at 2 o'clock in the morning every single morning, then a reasonable judge is likely to say that that is going to be a nuisance to a reasonable person, and they may well grant vacant possession on that basis. So there's something that's changed there. But in terms of the main ones, firstly, let me just share with you, if you want to, if you want some bedtime reading, because you're struggling to get off to sleep, then you can download here the full list of proposed grounds for Section 8 vacant possession. But ultimately, the ones that are likely, many of them are for social landlords, the ones that are likely to concern, landlords in the private rental sector are if they want to sell or move back in, or if there are arrears. And so I'll just quickly talk through a little bit about each of those as well. There's a new ground, Section 1A, within there, and that's if the landlord wants to sell. Crucially, you cannot issue that immediately a tenancy starts. That first 6 months of the tenancy has to happen. And this is where there's a sort of an interesting point within the Renters Reform Bill, where actually, in some instances, the tenant has less security than they do currently under an assured short-hold tenancy. Because at the moment, if you issue a 12 or a 24-month tenancy, unless you buy them out of that contract or they agree to leave early, you can't sell the property. They have a guaranteed tenancy for that 12 or 24 months. The proposal under this new regime is that after 6 months, should a landlord wish to sell, then that landlord can give 2 months' notice that that's what they wish to do. And at that point, the tenant has to vacate so the landlord can sell the property. Now, the shrewd amongst you might be thinking, I have a cunning wheeze, I don't like this tenant, I'm going to tell them I'm going to sell it, but not really mean it, and get them out that way. It's a nice idea, but firstly, let me remind you of a couple of things. This has already been up and running in Scotland for a few years now, so they've been the trailblazer for this sort of thing. But remember what I said earlier. If you want to get possession, you have to go through the courts. And if you stand in front of a judge and tell them that you're selling the property and that you have actually no intention of doing that and don't do that, then you are committing contempt of court. And the privilege of committing contempt of court is you yourself become a tenant at His Majesty's pleasure. And so I wouldn't recommend going down that route. There will also be some checks and balances as well, but ultimately, that is a criminal offence and isn't something you want to be found on the wrong side of. You may well find, there will be aspects where you can change your mind, and of course, if the court is backed up some 6-9 months and you've been given 3 months grace to change your mind, but the tenant will be out by then anyway, there are likely to be some test cases here. Until we have judicial precedent, i.e. the first poor individual has taken this through the courts and been challenged and all the rest of it, and the judge has actually decided, it's going to be a little bit of a grey area. But don't find yourselves in contempt of court. That is not going to be the answer. Similarly, for arrears, there's going to be this new ground 8A for repeated rent arrears. Now, the bar for achieving that from a tenant's perspective is quite high. They need to be consistently and persistently in arrears. And what I mean by that is they have to be more than 2 months in arrears in 3 separate occasions over a 3-year rolling period. Now, as a landlord, you're going to be pretty miffed if they hit that bar. But the good news is if they hit that bar, you can then go down the accelerated possession route. But this is yet another reason why rent and legal protection is so important. You need to insure against this sort of outcome, because without it, imagine being in arrears 3 times over 3 years, each time being 2 months in arrears. That's a lot of money on 3 separate occasions. So with the 3 strikes and you're out sort of policy, then there is a mechanism under the new ground 8A for gaining possession.
Thanks, Brendan. One of the other things which the government is keen to do is to provide a voice for tenants and information. And one of the ways they're doing this is introducing a landlord redress scheme or a property ombudsman scheme. The reason behind this is really to give access to consumers, or tenants in this case, access to free redress without having to go through the courts, which is obviously costly. Now, as agents, we have had to be members of an ombudsman scheme for many years now. But this is why it's important for individual landlords, because now you as individuals are going to be required to also be members of a redress or a property ombudsman scheme. The scheme will have various powers. It's going to keep an eye on landlord behaviour. It's going to ensure that repairs and standards of properties are up to standard. It will have quite far-reaching powers. They're going to be able to force landlords to provide an apology, carry out repairs, pay compensation, and also take remedial action. Critically, they can also expel landlords from the scheme. Now, it will be mandatory to be a member of the scheme. So if you're expelled, you're not going to be able to rent a property out. Now, you need to think about this in the bigger picture. As an individual landlord, you are going to need to be a member of an ombudsman. So you need to make sure that you are doing everything by the book and that you adhere to the guidelines of the ombudsman scheme. Now, as an individual landlord, you are actually also going to have to be a member of an ombudsman, even if you have an agent. So they're going for double whammy there. And I wonder if that's something to do with the fact that they're actually charging landlords and agents to become members of the scheme. Well, I'll let you make a decision on that. One thing that I would point out, though, is that, you know, the voice of the landlords is getting lost in this bigger picture. And again, I think in the redress scheme, that is also the case, because actually, as a private landlord, who do you complain to if you are feeling hard done by, or you feel that your tenants aren't playing by the book? Really hard, and actually you don't have a voice. And again, I know I'm going on about Parkers, but actually if you are using an agent to manage your property, the only place you are going to be able to complain to is actually the agent. So, you know, it's one thing to bear in mind. So the other part of this sort of government proposal to tidy up the rental sector is to have a property portal, a sort of one-stop shop, if you like, as one place to go to for all your property needs. I think the idea behind it is it's going to be something a little bit like you have for your car and your MOT. So there will be one place that tenants and landlords can go to find about everything they need to know about a landlord and also a property. So, for example, if you have your property on there, it will say you've got your gas safety due, your EPCs are C, you're due to have your insurance renewed, perhaps, something like that. This landlord has a large number of properties, this landlord's in an individual property, that sort of information. It's also to help keep landlords up to date with all the latest changes in legislation, and hopefully that will be useful for landlords. But I think what would be useful for tenants as well is that they're going to be able to log on there. They're going to see, I'm going to apply for this property in Witney. What's it like? Is it a decent property? What's my landlord like? Because also on this portal, they're going to have a rogue landlord database. So if you as a landlord have been taken to court or you have a banning order against you, your name will be on this portal and you will be as part of this rogue landlord database. So I think actually for tenants and for landlords, the idea behind it is actually a very good one, because it will give you the information that you need. Landlords will be required to keep their registration up to date. And if it's not up to date, you'll be removed from the database. And a bit like the redress scheme, if you're not on there, you're not going to be able to rent a property out or find tenants for your property. Linking back to what Brendan mentioned on earlier about civil authorities and enforcement penalties, this is going to be the ideal place for these authorities to go to find out, have you got your gas safety up to date? Are you renting out a property that doesn't have a license in a licensed area? So landlords are going to have to ensure that they are 100% up to date with all their information all the time. And guess what? Parkers, if we're managing your property, will make sure that your record is up to date. It's a big, big project, this. And if you can think about the number of properties and the number of landlords in England at the moment, they've got to get all that information onto one portal at one time. It's probably going to be a bit of a work in progress, starting off as a database and developing into a bigger portal by the end. It's going to be costs involved, probably costs per property that you rent out. Again, we don't know, but we do know that there will be some financial implications for landlords going forward.
So pets is another one of the changes. There's a lot of talk around this. So there will be a general right for any tenant to ask the landlord to keep a pet at the property, and the landlord will not be able to unreasonably refuse. Now, everything that we do here teaches us that most tenants that ask for a pet do have a very well-behaved pet. So it isn't anything to worry about as a landlord. You have to remember that tenants have got a 5-week deposit tied into their tenancy. Hopefully you've had an inventory done at the beginning and you have a checkout done at the end. That will then show you any damage that that pet has caused. So any damage caused, the tenant will be paying for, and it will come out of their deposit. So they're unlikely to have pets that are damaging those properties. Should you have a tenant that is asking you to have a pet, they must put that in writing to your managing agent or to yourself as the landlord, and you have a strict 42-day time limit to either give that consent or refuse it. If you need some more information to make a proper judgment call on this, so you may need the breed of the pet, the age of the pet. If you ask the tenant for that information, you will then have an extra 7 days on top of the 42-day time limit to make your decision. Now, there will be a change to the tenant fee ban in relation to this. At the moment, we're not able to charge tenants to have indemnity and insurance for a pet, but they are saying that they'll change that and we will be able to charge tenants for that. So they should be able to have indemnity and insurance on this. And there will also be no specific power to evict for the non-compliance of this. Now, of course, there will be situations where you're not able to give that permission. So you may have a flat in a property in a block of flats and you're not the head lease. The head lease may well say that you can't have pets. As a singular landlord, you cannot change that head lease. So you would have to refuse permission on the head lease basis. There may also be a situation where perhaps it's a family home and you'll be moving back into it in a couple of years' time and you have got an allergy for pets or for a certain type of pet. Again, you will be able to refuse permission for that. There will be changes to this. So as and when we hear anything, we'll let you know and we'll keep you up to date with it all.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So one of the things I mentioned that will be coming as part of this that we know about are that written terms will be required. And what I mean by that is at the start of any new tenancy, then the tenant will have to be given some written terms. And we spoke briefly about tenancies that will migrate onto this that are pre-existing tenancies. At the point at which they migrate, they will have to be given, before they migrate, they'll have to be given these written terms. And that will contain all the specific information, information about the tenant's rights and things that are specific to the tenancy itself. But really importantly, once we have one of these new, effectively periodic tenancies, any attempts to try and create a fixed term on that. So, if you allude to it or try and squeeze something into a tenancy agreement or whatever, civil penalty up to, you guessed it right, up to £30,000. There's just no chance of getting around that. And again, we're seeing here they're drawing on legislation from other nations. Wales, this has come in fairly recently. France do something very similar. And so I think this legislation is leaning on some other nations and certainly devolved nations trialing some of these things in advance. But I say it must be given before the tenancy starts, and it's enforceable by that fairly hefty civil penalty. HMOs, licensed properties, etc., are slightly different, but this is one of the things that we know is going to form part of the bill. I'm now moving on to a slightly more nebulous area, and I'm going to delve under the desk for my crystal ball, because I'm going to try and talk to you about when we think this stuff is coming in, and that is slightly harder. Obviously, at the moment, we're in the middle of party conference season. Michael Gove has said that this is still absolutely coming in. And the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities have said, yeah, it's going to be in by spring. Labour Party conference is on today. Actually quite a lot about housing on there. And it's interesting how both conferences have spoken about housing at some length. When if you think back to the budget in spring, bearing in mind that housing is one of the biggest issues facing this country, it didn't get a single mention. So really interesting. This is now becoming an election issue, and that's why we may well see something before the general election, because of course, if we think about the time frame of this, a new bit of legislation takes 8 to 10 months to come to fruition. Now, we've only just had, a few months back now, but we're only at the first reading stage in the House of Commons. So if you look at my table there on the slide, there are 3 columns, House of Commons, House of Lords, and the final stages. We're only at the top of column 1, and they happen sequentially. Right, so we've got 8 to 10 months, and we've barely started. If we think, we're now in party conference season, then there'll be a King's speech. We'll have an autumn statement, what used to be called the budget. Then there'll be Christmas, and everyone goes and gets drunk. And at some point, there is going to be a general election called. And if that's called before all this work is finished, then we'll probably enter purdah, and the bill will stop there, and it'll be left for the new government to pick up once that general election has happened. So really, it's fairly binary. Either this will be completed before the general election is called, or that general election will be called, and then all bets are off, depending on what colour of government we see in the future. Because you can see, through the House of Commons, once we have the second reading, which people are starting to talk about now, there is still no date yet, and it needs to go into that very busy Commons diary. Once that second reading has happened, they then go to committee stage. And that's when it gets really busy, and they call in the experts, and they call for reports, and they get into the detail and the nitty-gritty to try and stop any sort of laws of unintended consequences of creating further problems downstream. And only after they've been through all of that process does it go to the third reading, and then gets chucked up to the House of Lords, and they pretty much go through the whole thing all over again. There might then be some flick-flacking between the two, or they agree on the proposed amendments, and only then will it be given royal assent. And at that point, it passes onto the statute books and becomes law. But even that doesn't mean it starts on that day. So once it's given royal assent and the King says, yeah, sign this off, it's now law. As I said at the very start, we will almost certainly be given 6 months grace period before this actually kicks in. So we've got to go through all of this, passes on to law, and the first new tenancies will be affected 6 months after that, usually around an April or a September timeframe. But of course, as Katie was mentioning earlier, if you have a pre-existing tenancy and you put it onto a longer fixed term, it may be up to 18 months before they actually become, they fall under the Renters Reform Bill. So again, is this going to come in? Don't know. I think there is a great deal of political will to get this in. I think because this has been spoken about since the Queen's speech of 2019 is when it was officially brought up, although people were talking about it before, and because it has cross-party support, and because it is becoming a very powerful election issue, I think the Conservatives are very keen to get something in, but equally they might find they're just out of time. There is speculation that some of the delays we've experienced very recently are because there are a lot of landlord Conservative members of Parliament on the backbenches, and they're uncomfortable with this in its current guise, and they've sort of dampened things down. So will it now have time to complete that entire process you see on the slide in front of you now before that election is called? I don't know. Certainly what we're hearing through the Lettings Industry Council is that if it does get through, then Labour are likely to leave well alone, in that if it gets to that stage, they also want to see the abolition of Section 21s, and they will probably leave them. But, and this is the big but, if it doesn't complete those hurdles before the general election and Labour win the next general election, then all bets are off. They may well come up with something entirely different. And so this is why we're following it very carefully. We're seeing what happens. But I think if this is going to happen, there is real impetus for it to happen. But it's whether or not they can get it across the line in time, and whether it's being used to sort of pull the rabbit out of the hat just before the general election. I'll let you be the judge. But fundamentally, this all boils down to one simple thing. There's just not enough property. And landlords exiting the sector because of concerns isn't the right answer. It's driving up rents. And actually, a private rental sector is part of a healthy housing market balance in this country. So that's about 45 minutes. I think we've managed to whistle through just about everything that we wanted to cover. If you have any questions after this, then you can WhatsApp, phone, email, whatever. But I'm just going to have a look onto the chat because I can see We've got a few bits on chat. I haven't had a chance to look at this yet and see if we've got any questions here. And similarly, if you haven't yet asked a question, but you've got a burning question, type it in now and we'll get to it, because I'll start at the top and work our way down. Will Parker's send, as our agents, Section 21 notice to the tenants? Absolutely, at the moment. Of course, once this comes to pass, as tabled, then Section 21s will no longer exist. There will not be Section 21s, and you won't be able to issue one, because if you do, if you issue the wrong notice, funnily enough, civil penalty, you guessed it, up to £30,000. And I'm afraid I'm not going to take that one on for you. On the first screen, someone, Harry has said something about rent caps. Was that per month or per year? What is proposed? Right, that wasn't rent cap. There won't be rent caps. We'll be talking about rent controls. But I think the figures of £3,500 and £10,000, Katie, refer to minimum energy efficiency standards and the amount that landlords have to spend improving their energy performance certificates.
Yeah, exactly that. And if you have got a particular property and you want us to have a look into your EPC, we can have a look at that, give you some advice. We've got lots of contractors that are working alongside us to try and bring these standards up, but there'll be more advice as it comes in the near future.
Brilliant, thank you. Trevor, any reason for not including agreed rent increases in the initial assured short hold tenancy? Yes, two very significant problems with that, I'm afraid. Firstly, it won't be an assured short hold tenancy. It'll be an assured tenancy, because assured short hold tenancies will be banned. And if you include a rent increase in there, you'll be breaking the law. And if I could hear you, I'm sure you'd all be singing along now, up to £30,000. So yeah, nice idea. You can do it now, and you can do it, any point up until this, comes into law. But once the Renters Reform Bill comes in, you will not be able to have an assured short hold tenancy, and you will not be able to put any rent increase clauses within that agreement, I'm afraid.
Your way around that will be issuing a Section 13, but only 12 months after the initial tenancy has begun. So it'll be Section 13s, not rent review clauses.
Another one from Harry. What will the minimum EPC grade be, D or C, and from when? Joy, did you want to have a little bit about that one?
Your guess is as good as ours, isn't it? I mean, I think the long goal is to get it to a C. When from? Your guess is as good as ours. As Katie was alluding to earlier, the changes will happen. It will be one day a C, but realistically, I think we're way off yet.
I think absolutely no time soon. I mean, this was part of one of those myriad of things that Rishi Sunak sort of threw out of the bath just a few days ago, along with the 7 bins and all those other things that never really existed. But they're starting to realise that the private rental sector is essential. It's really interesting how that sort of mood music is changing. And so, landlords are no longer the arch enemy, they're just the enemy. And, it's becoming more positive, and they realise that the private rental sector is essential. And so the last thing they want to do is suddenly alienate a load of properties and a load of landlords by implementing something that, particularly in areas like this, where there are so many older cottages, very, very difficult or expensive to try and get to a C. And so, there is no time frame for that, but anything about 2028 or whatever is just out for the time being. So watch this space, but it's not happening for the time being. I'm sure it will come back at some point in the future. Who will be running the portal, Joy? Have you got any more insights on that one?
I don't. I mean, it will be a government-run scheme, such as the property ombudsman scheme that we have, and any ombudsman. Whether it's one or whether it's multiple schemes, again, we don't know the answer to that. It would make sense for it to be one scheme. I'm not sure that they will listen to sense. So it will be a government-approved ombudsman, and I'm hoping it will be the one scheme, and it'll be the ombudsman which you're already a member of.
Absolutely. Next one, if a landlord is allergic to pets, can he or she decline reasonably to have pets? And I think, Katie, what do you think?
That would be perfectly fair to refuse it on those terms. Again, like Brendan said, it's one of those tried and tested things. Until we say no and somebody pushes it, the tenant pushes it further and it's looked into, we don't know the answer. Our best guess is that it would be perfectly fair to refuse that on the basis of an allergy.
Sounds reasonable to me, and there are some, religious exemptions as well, potentially within there. So again, we just have to work with judicial precedents. There will be the legislation, and then that will be tested in the courts, and then we'll start to settle down. Who's next?
Yeah, I can answer Barbara's question. We have already sent the How to Rent guide to all our managed tenancies. We would recommend any landlords that look after their own properties and their own tenancies just to send that as a matter of course, and to ensure that the new How to Rent guide is issued before notice is obtained.
And I don't wish to put everyone to sleep, but just to reiterate something that Katie said, the vast majority of short-term tenancies at the moment, when they come to an end, if you don't renew them onto a new fixed term, well, they will all become periodic. But there are two types of periodic, and you've got the contractual and the statutory ones. If it becomes a statutory one, then you're opening yourselves up to all sorts of potential problems, one of which is it's a new tenancy and you do have to issue this. If it becomes a contractual one, as the Parker's tenancy agreement does, then you're safe from all of that. But the vast majority of tenancy agreements don't create contractual periodic tenancies. They will effectively resort to the standard, the default, which is a statutory periodic. Is the portal similar to the Welsh Rent Smart Wales? The simple answer, we don't know yet because it doesn't exist. I suspect they'll learn from what has happened in the devolved nations, but we just don't know yet, or even who will be providing that. Charlotte's asked, what about HMO for students for 12-month contracts? This is a really interesting question. They've realised that as it stood, the first draft was going to create all sorts of unholy mayhem for student tenancies. And so this is one of the areas that we will undoubtedly, there's an awful lot of pressure coming from landlord bodies, from Property Mark, from the industry, and they've realised that they need to relook at it specifically for these types of tenancies. And so we are expecting to see some change in that. As it stands at the moment, it's not good news, but everybody's talking sensibly about making some amendments around student let. So watch this space. Assume there's no need to register for the property ombudsman yet. Correct, because it doesn't exist. It only exists for agents at the moment. We don't yet know whether there'll be one scheme, multiple schemes, or who that provider will be. But just as a reminder, if you're landlords at the moment managing your own tenants, then you should be already registered with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, because you're processing tenants' data, and there's a very clear precedent on that. So if you're managing a tenancy and you're not registered with the ICO on an annual basis, I'd go away and have a look at that. And Jay, have I missed one? No, I missed one, did I? Sorry. Graham, what's the best way to word a contract at 1 month at a time or 28 days? 1 month at a time or 28 days?
1 month. Per calendar.
1 month.
Yeah.
Per calendar month. Yeah, absolutely. And which is the one I missed? Sorry, Joy.
Julia.
Julia, sorry, I missed you there. Isn't there also new legislation regarding phased out use of gas boilers in the pipeline? Yes, there was. Again, this was something that was changed, I think, by Rishi Sunak's basket of green measures that got thrown out the window, and I think that was pushed back slightly. This isn't specific to rental properties. This is to do with wider properties and the sale of gas boilers in the future, and the rollout of those being pushed back. Because it's not letting specific, I've not got the dates, but we can find out for you and double check. But that's a sort of wider housing piece rather than specifically relating to tenancies. And Jay, hello Jay, our new build flats are heated using electric radiators. As a result, they're an EPC-E. Electric is the way forward. However, we would not comply with an EPC-C. What are your thoughts on future changes? I think we've largely covered this, but they're not coming in at the moment. They may well rear their heads again in the future, but at the moment you're safe, but I can't say for how long. It is what it is, but equally, changes are being made all the time about how efficient energy heaters are, about ways to generate electricity differently so that they could become, solar, wind, whatever. Biomass could make those more efficient. And interestingly, very boringly, the calculations that you use to work out an energy performance rating are changed on a fairly regular basis. Sometimes they change, their calculations on how energy efficient a particular type of wall is. Other times it's based on whether gas or electric, their relative prices will affect how energy efficient the property is. So if the price of electricity comes down as we generate more renewable energy, then actually electric heaters will become more efficient, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would also add in there, with everything, there is going to be exemptions. So it's more than likely you'll be able to apply for an exemption. And as long as that you can prove that you've done everything possible to that property to try and bring that EPC rating up, so you're already working on electric radiators rather than gas, you've got all the cavity wall insulation, energy efficient light bulbs, everything that you can do, and it still hasn't brought it up, it is likely that you'll be able to apply for exemption on that one.
I hope that's been helpful. I think we've reached the end of the questions. We will be sending this out to everybody via email in the next 24 hours or so. So if you'd like to revisit any of it, please do. And likewise, if you want to book a call with any of us or ask any questions, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. But really pleased you could join us this evening. We hope that's been of interest. It's been our first one, so thank you for being relatively gentle with us. And we hope to see you when we do another one at some point in the not too distant future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.